Today is Sunday, June 4th, Trinity Sunday, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Before I get started, I'll warn you that there's likely going to be some noise in the background because all the kids are out in the driveway playing basketball on a Sunday afternoon, and they can get pretty rowdy. What I'd like to talk about today is based on an email I received from a friend who wrote with some questions after listening to another talk that I had posted a week or two ago. And the topic, to put it simply, is what is the goal of our arguments and debates? What's the goal of our arguments and debates? And I'm going to take a minute and read the email that he wrote because I think it's important. I think many Catholics likely ask this same question and have this same concern that he has because of all of our daily conversations and arguments, social media discussions we have with coworkers, discussions we have with relatives or friends. It seems as Catholics that these controversial discussions are impossible to avoid. Not that we would want to avoid them, but they just are always presented to us, and it can be very, very wearying. It can be discouraging. It can be frustrating if we don't understand and have a clear sense of what the goal of these discussions should be. So I'm going to read his message and then try to answer that question and talk about things in a simple and practical way. So let me read his email real quick. I don't think there's anything in this email that's personal. I think it's pretty general. So let me read through it. Dear Mr. Michael, I heard your talk on the cause of today's problems. That was a walk talk I did a week or two ago. I heard your talk on the cause of today's problems, and there is a particular symptom of abandoning classical studies that is very discouraging to me, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on it. The symptom I am referring to is the seemingly uselessness or the seeming uselessness of debate in modern society. I see all the time on your Facebook account, referring to my Facebook account, people unable to address the points that you make, but going off on tangents. I also see in your Facebook discussions people who are unable to provide evidence when you request it. It seems like they don't know how to provide evidence, or they don't understand what this means. I have encountered the same problems in conversations that I have with my peers. For example, and this does get a little personal, so I'm just going to summarize. He says, for example, I sent an essay that he had written on a controversial subject to a fellow Catholic who criticizes the Pope, and I think that either he did not bother to read it, or he simply does not know how to follow arguments, because soon after he was accusing me of worshiping the Pope as a god. After that, I simply disengaged with the conversation. I do not see the point in continuing a conversation with someone who is either not interested in the topic or who is unable to talk about the topic. My question is, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with this? Because I know you deal with this a lot. What principles do you use as to how far you go in a discussion? So he asks, how do you deal with this? And what principles do you use as to how far you go in a discussion? So I think I'm going to stop reading there and get into this. And like I said, I think this is something that many of us face regularly. I obviously do, but I'm sort of an extreme example because I spend so much time engaging in these discussions, and maybe that's why he's writing to me, because it seems that I must have some goal in these discussions, since they so often seem to end uselessly, as he says. So why would we bother? Why would we not just stop having these discussions? Just disengage and mind our own business, or find something better to do with our time. And I'd like to answer that, because I do think that I can share some things that are helpful. So why do we, or why should we, engage in these discussions and get into these arguments, discuss these controversial questions, when so often they seem to be useless? I'll argue very simply that what makes a discussion useless or not is whether it fulfills a goal, whether we achieve a goal in a discussion or debate. If we set a goal of one kind, we may find that the discussions are useless. But if the goal is different, that same discussion can actually be very useful. And so I don't think the question is, in an absolute sense, are these discussions useful or are they just useless? I think we have to ask, what is the goal that makes these discussions useful? What should the goal be? And this is very important, I think. And I think modern Christians get this all wrong. And this is why they end up with this discouraged attitude. And they start to lose interest in these controversial discussions and arguments, because they say, oh, this is just a waste of time. This is just useless. I've got better things to do. I really don't know that we have anything better to do than to try to explain and defend the truth. In fact, I'm quite certain that we don't have anything better to do than that, because truth is the end of our whole existence. That's why the motto of the Dominican order is veritas, just truth. Truth is the end of the whole universe, the end of our life for certain. We're intellectual beings, rational beings, and as far as our intellect concerned, its end is truth. So there's nothing that we can possibly seek, intellectually at least, that's more important than truth, and we have a duty to defend the truth. So we really don't have a choice as to whether we'll defend the truth or not. We have to. That's what a wise man does. In fact, if you look to the writings of Thomas Aquinas, he asks the question, what is the end of a wise man? What is the goal of a wise man's life? And he says it's to establish and defend the truth. So these discussions are certainly necessary and useful, but I think that most Christians go into them with the wrong goal. And this is what leads them to this vexation. So let's talk about this a little bit. And to begin, I'm going to share an illustration that I think makes this clear. I live out in the country on a farm, and I spend a couple hours every day out in my gardens. Out in the gardens, I've got some small fruit trees, small fruit bushes like blueberries and blackberries. And then there's herbs and vegetables in the main garden, garlic and tomatoes and peppers and onions, cantaloupes, squash, and so on. Now, if someone were to visit and find me out in the garden spending 2 hours cultivating a row of peppers, they might think to themselves and say, this guy owns the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. What in the world is he doing weeding peppers? And it's true, there's so much that I could do. There are so many projects to work on. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy has so many opportunities to do all kinds of exciting things, and yet every day from 4 to 6, I spend 2 hours working in the garden. Now, the answer to that question would determine whether it's a good use of my time or a stupid use of my time. If I said, well, the reason why I work out in the garden every day, 2 hours a day, so that's 12 hours a week or so. I usually don't work on Sundays. Let's say 12 hours a week in the garden, and I get paid $50 an hour for online tutoring. So 12 hours times $50, that's $600 a week of income that I could be losing by messing around with these vegetables. And some people think of it like that. So if I was going out into the garden and I said, well, the reason is because I want to save some money on vegetables, that would be pretty stupid, because I could much more easily make enough money to buy all the vegetables we could ever eat, and it would make no sense to be working in the garden rather than working in classical education. But that's not my goal when I go out to work in the garden. If it was my goal, it would be foolish, but it's not my goal. Some people might say, oh, well, you could grow your own food and it's organic, it's healthier. That's not the reason either. That's not why I go out into the garden. My family enjoys perfect health, and we really don't have any need for any special quality of food. That's not why I work in the garden. The reason I go out to work in the garden is very simple. I want some physical exercise. I want some fresh air. I want some sun. I want to get away from my desk. I like to be out in the garden. It's an opportunity for me to exercise my whole body. I can do as much or as little as I want. I can push myself really hard one day, or I can take it easy one day, depending on what's going on. The real reason why I work in the garden 2 hours a day is because I personally want to receive physical benefits of working in the garden. That's why I do it. Even if my plants didn't produce much fruit, even if I lost a crop due to a storm or some other problem, I would still garden every day, because the end of my garden work is not, at least the proper end, or the primary end of my garden work is not actually to get fruits and vegetables. It's to get physical exercise, to sweat a little, to get some sun, to get some fresh air, to use all my muscles, to be flexible. And while I work in the garden, I usually stick my phone in my pocket and listen to audiobooks of Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle or some other philosopher. So I use the time for my own reading and reflection, because I'm normally occupied with the work of a tutor, and I don't get much time just to read and think for myself. That's why I garden. Now, when you consider that as the goal of gardening, no one can deny that it's useful and good. And what's even better about gardening, because every day at 4 o'clock, just about every day, my wife takes all of our children to the health club, and they go swimming and they lift weights and play basketball and do all kinds of other physical activities. They go to the health club. My daughter goes to her dance classes. The boys may go to martial arts classes, but they have their own forms of exercise. But I don't necessarily want to do that. I like working in the garden, because when I do my exercise in the garden, a byproduct of that exercise is production of a great deal of food for the kitchen, and it also beautifies our property, makes our property a nice place to live, a nice place to go for a walk, a nice place to sit, have a cup of coffee and talk. So there are byproducts of my garden work that I receive as a result of my exercise. And you can see how changing the goal of the activity completely changes our perspective on whether it's useless or useful. I'm healthy and fit at 48 years of age, even though I live a highly sedentary life. And that's because of gardening. It's very useful if that's the goal. If the goal was to save money on food or to get higher quality produce than I can get in the store, I don't think that would be very useful. It's not necessary. So I think that gives us a good illustration of how the usefulness of a thing really depends on the goal that it's pursued for. Now, when it comes to these discussions and debates, like this friend of mine writes, I spend a lot of time in these discussions. Everyone knows that. Just look at all these walk talks. I spend a lot of time engaging people in discussions, arguments, debates, and I go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth hours a day, hours and hours and hours, and I've been doing this for 15 years. Why would I do that? Anyone who follows me on social media or follows these discussions, they know how it usually goes. Someone may post something that's false and I'll object to it and get into a discussion with them back and forth. Or I'll post something and someone will object to it and we'll go back and forth. Most of the time, as a Catholic, I'm representing the truth and I'm discussing it or arguing with someone who is caught up in some false idea. And the back and forth usually doesn't go very well. Eventually they call me names, or they start with personal attacks, or they change subjects, or they start firing all kinds of information. And then I sort through it and show them that this thing they said is not true, this they have no evidence for, this doesn't support their point, and so on. And I go through these discussions, and I spend hours and hours and hours in these discussions. And again, just as with gardening, someone may say, this guy's running the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. He's got thousands of enrolled students. Why in the world is he wasting his time in these discussions, often with nobodies? Why would anybody do this? It seems useless. Now, if I said, my goal in these discussions is to convince the person that I'm speaking with and cause him to come to my opinion, anyone following these discussions would see that that almost never happens, or never is seen to happen. It's almost never seen where one of these discussions leads the other person to say, Eureka, you're right. That almost never happens. And if that was the goal, or my goal in these discussions, man, it would be a waste of time. Because it almost never happens, and in most cases, it can't happen. Often, the issue is a matter of faith, and faith is a supernatural gift. All the arguing in the world can't cause a person to believe in something that can only be known and received by faith. Jesus performed miracles in the presence of thousands of people, and they did not believe. Obviously, the purpose of those miracles was not to make all of those people believe, because if it was, Jesus failed. In the same way, my goal in these discussions is never to convince the other person to admit that I'm right and join my camp, as it were. And the Pope wisely advises us on this when he criticizes Catholics who proselytize others. And some Catholics get all riled up about this, and they criticize the Pope as usual because he says that we should not proselytize. And the folks on social media condemn the Pope as if the Pope is preventing them from immediately converting everyone to the Catholic faith. Like they were in the midst of leading whole armies of people into the church by the power of their arguments, and the Pope messed it all up. No, that's not what's happening at all. And proselytization tends to err in the sense that people who undertake that work don't really understand the nature of these discussions, and they imagine that belief in these areas is simply a matter of hearing the right information, or hearing the right argument, or having the information presented in the right way, as if people don't believe because they simply have never heard the truth before, and that's false. So it's a flawed idea of the actual problem that leads to a flawed idea of the remedy, and they go about arguing with people with the end of their argument being to convince the other person and try to make them become a Catholic or join their political camp or whatever the subject may be. And this isn't wise. And most of the time it's useless. And it often leads to abuses of other people, disrespect for other people, neglect of the complexity of the problems that people are actually dealing with, just an unrealistic expectation as regards these kinds of discussions. If the goal of these discussions was to convince someone and make them come to our side, they would almost always be useless. And I think we'd all be discouraged. And this is one of the reasons why people don't engage in these discussions at all. They're afraid of, quote unquote, failing, because they don't understand what they actually should be doing. Again, if that's the goal, these discussions are almost always useless. And you'll hear people try to explain it away by saying things like, well, we're just trying to plant the seed. Just trying to plant the seed. Well, they're not really trying to plant the seed. They're trying to convince a person of something that often depends on theological virtues which don't come through arguments. We see the same problem in parenting. And I've talked about this at length in the past, where parents say things like, the goal of our parenting is to raise saints. And that just reveals an ignorance of what parenting is. Parents do not have the ability to raise saints. One can be a perfectly faithful parent and raise a prodigal. Another person can be a completely neglectful parent and raise a saint. And we can point out examples of this, not just through history, but in our own lives. We can think of examples. Great adults, great faithful Catholic adults that came from unfaithful parents, and terrible prodigals who came from solid Catholic families. The goal of parenting can't be to raise saints, because that's not in the power of parenting. Just as convincing people of what's true is rarely ever in the power of the one who's arguing. So that can't be the goal. And if we do pursue that as the goal, we'll often be frustrated and vexed. So what is the goal? I can say that certainly isn't my goal when I get into these discussions. I don't think to myself, oh, look, there's a guy on Facebook talking about gay rights or gay marriage or some other topic. Let me go convince him and make him agree with me. I never think that. I never attempt that. I don't think that that's even possible. When I see someone post something that I believe is false, I'll object to it, because I have a duty to object to what's false. I have a duty to defend the truth. And when I do that, I'm doing it for the sake of the truth. I'm making a defense. I'm protecting the truth, as it were. Stepping in and saying, you don't understand this topic, or you're misrepresenting the truth on this issue, and I'd like to clarify it. I'm acting on behalf of the truth. I have to. I have to. But I'm acting on behalf of the truth. And that's a simple duty. It's an objective duty, and I can judge myself to have successfully done so at the end of a discussion. That's one of my goals in getting into those discussions. I'd like to simply defend the truth. If I see someone, for example, saying that Pope Francis worshipped Pachamama and he is an idolater, that is obviously false. And I feel I have a duty to clarify the situation and prove that that accusation is impossible to demonstrate. And it is, of course. So it's those situations where I act to simply make a defense for the truth. That's my goal. It's in my power to succeed. And at the end of the discussion, I can turn away satisfied that I fulfilled my duty to the truth. Another goal that I have in these discussions is personal. Contrary to what many people may think, I learn a great deal from these discussions. Whether I'm arguing with a scholar or whether I'm arguing with a guy who drives a school bus. These discussions of controversial issues reveal many important things that I wouldn't learn by sitting around reading and reflecting on things myself. These discussions help me to see what other people think, how other people think. These discussions help me to learn what other people's hang-ups are, what the real problems are that keep people, at least humanly speaking, from believing the truth. They also help me to identify what the real key arguments are, what the key truths are on different subjects, in different controversies, and so on. Often these discussions lead us down rabbit trails that reveal some important concept that I never would have thought of. And so I personally engage in those discussions for my own learning. It's as if you were walking through the woods and you suddenly came across a trail that you've never seen before, which wanders off into the forest, and you say, hey, let's go down this, let's follow this trail and see where it goes. You take the trail and follow it just for the sake of learning where it goes. And as far as learning where it goes is concerned, taking the trail is useful. That's one of the reasons why I engage, again, hours a day in all kinds of controversial discussions. They're helpful for me. They help to reveal weaknesses in my own learning. We may get into a discussion and the discussion goes down a path and I say, man, I really don't know much about this subject. This is a gap in my learning. You know, this guy started talking about microbiology as we were discussing this question, and I realized I don't know anything about microbiology. I need to study microbiology. Or someone may start talking about a certain historical period and I say, man, I really don't know much about 19th century American history. I need to spend some time learning about that period of history. These discussions reveal gaps in my own learning. They help me identify the key issues which may not be what most people spend their time arguing about. For example, in the abortion, pro-life and pro-choice arguments, most Christian people who argue pro-life don't understand the nature of the debate, and that they've already lost before the discussions begin by allowing their opponents to identify not as the pro-abortion side of the argument, but as the pro-choice side of the argument. Allowing them to take that position causes the pro-life people to lose right from the beginning. And Christians spend all their time wrangling and wrangling and wrangling, copying and pasting the same old, dead, ineffective arguments and memes and information, and they ignore the fact that the nature of this problem has nothing to do with those facts. It's got to do with how these two sides have defined themselves, because the Christians allowed the pro-abortion crowd to identify as pro-choice rather than pro-abortion. And the Christians have allowed themselves to take an extreme position in these disputes, which in a democratic society that refuses to establish religion makes the pro-life position almost impossible to defend. And the Christians, the pro-life Americans, I should say, lost this debate before a single argument was even made, and they continue to do so. Now, they've won recently on Roe v. Wade just because of a fortunate swing of Supreme Court justice nominations, but in general, they're losing this argument, which should not even be present in our society. And so I can learn by entering in these discussions what the real problem is. And it's often not what most people spend their time talking about. So I enter into these discussions for my own sake. And for my own sake, they're almost always useful. I almost always come away from these discussions having learned something, having gained a better insight into the nature of this controversy and what the real crucial issues are. Another benefit of these discussions is because I gain experience through these discussions, and when I talk about different topics or answer different questions, I get to practice answering them, and I learn by repetition and experience how to answer them. When times come up for me to answer a question, I can do so very easily because I've already worked out my responses through hours and hours of discussion in the past on this topic. These walk talks are a good example. I can grab my phone, go for a walk, hit the record button, and make an hour-long talk that seems pretty well ordered and is pretty clear. Not because I'm some kind of genius who thinks of all this stuff on the spot, but because I've already thought through these things and talked through these things many times in the past. And I've already got the illustrations and the examples and the Bible verses and the sources of the philosophers. I've already got them figured out and searched out, so that when someone asks me a question and I answer on my feet, I'm ready to give a defense, because I've already been through this argument 1,000 times with similar people, asking similar questions, raising similar objections. I can anticipate the questions that are going to come. And so it assists me in doing this kind of work, where I spend so much of my time throughout the day taking questions from parents or students or people contacting me asking about Catholicism and classical education and parenting and all this other stuff. It helps me to have all of these answers ready to go. Just like an athlete trains and trains and trains so that when the game starts, he can just play. He doesn't have to think about what to do because he's already learned it from experience and drilled it and trained in it, so that when the game begins, he can just go out there and let her rip. So what you see is that I engage in these discussions out of a sense of duty to the truth and my desire to free the truth from confusion and misrepresentation. I do it for the sake of my own learning, using the people I discuss things with as helps for my own investigation of questions. And I use it also to develop my ability to answer questions on my feet real time, which is my full-time job, by constantly being in this exercise of discussing these things, articulating my thoughts, finding sources of support, finding sources of evidence, gathering those sources of support, figuring out different lines of argument, and assembling all of this in my head with constant practice and repetition. Those are the reasons why I engage in these discussions, and I can never fail. The discussions can never be a waste of time. They can never be useless. They're always useful. And there's one more important reason, and it's simply because I fear God. I fear God. There's a passage in the Old Testament where God is speaking to the prophet Ezekiel. And Ezekiel was a prophet, and remember, as Christians, we're all prophets in a general sense. We all have a duty to go into the world and make disciples. And now that I've become a Dominican, I have an even greater obligation because I'm a member of the Order of Preachers in the Catholic Church, and it's my duty to preach. My vocation as a Dominican is to preach. And in the book Ezekiel, in the Old Testament, God refers to Ezekiel as the watchman of the Lord. And God explains that the duty of the watchman is to let men know what's going on. If there's an invader, if an enemy approaches a city in the middle of the night, the watchman is to announce the presence of the enemy to the city. And if the watchman stays awake, pays attention, observes the enemy, and announces his approach, he's done his duty. And if the enemy were to attack the city and conquer the city and kill the people in the city, the watchman would be free from blame because he fulfilled his duty. But if the watchman fails or is afraid to announce the arrival of the enemy, and the enemy attacks the city and kills the people, the watchman will be held accountable for the lives of his fellow citizens because he did not do his duty as watchman. And God says that the prophet is like the watchman. His job is to make God's will known, make the truth known. He doesn't do it for the sake of results. He doesn't do it to eliminate problems that exist. He does it because that's his duty. His duty is to make the truth known. And so long as he fulfills that duty, he is free from blame for the consequences. And yet, God tells Ezekiel that if the watchman does not make the truth known, then he is accountable for the blood of his countrymen. And this is a warning to us in respect to our role as prophets. If the truth is made known to us, and we don't make it known to others, and they act contrary to it without our warning, not only are they condemned for their falsehood, but we are also condemned for our failure to warn them of their falsehood. And if we are faithful, and if we do warn them of the trouble, and they persist in it, they will suffer for their error, but we will have cleared ourselves and saved our own souls. And so this work of correcting error, this work of admonishing the sinner, this work of warning sinners and unbelievers of their errors, is a duty that I believe I need to fulfill for the sake of my own salvation. And so I don't do it because I'm bored or because I think it's fun. I do it because I believe that I have to do it. I have to object. I have to clarify. I have to correct. I have to. Not necessarily for their sake, because they have free will, and I can't control their decisions, even if I were to make the most eloquent arguments possible. They could simply reject it in their free will. And that's not why I engage. I engage for my own sake. For my own sake. So when I go to bed at night and I think to that person who was doing this or saying that, I'll know that I warned them that they were wrong. I warned them that what they were pursuing was evil, or that it was contrary to God's will, that it's contrary to the teaching of the church, and so on. I do it for my own sake, because I want to have a clear conscience and know that I admonished or warned the sinner. It's a work of mercy. It's a work of mercy. If I just ignore people in their errors, if I just ignore all the errors, if I ignore the false arguments, if I ignore the false information, if I ignore things that people say that are untrue, if I ignore it, and those things go on to influence others, how am I not partially responsible? I have to clarify it. I have to correct it. I have to warn people that if you follow this guy, you're going to end up in schism. If you follow this idea, you're going to end up ruining your family's life. If you go down this path, you're going to end up lost in heresy or sin. For my own sake, I have to know that I did what I could, humanly speaking, because that's my duty. And my duty is not dependent on the other person's reaction. My duty is not dependent on the other person's, or I should say on the results, what actually happened. That's not my responsibility. I can't control that. My responsibility is for my own soul. And that's my goal in engaging these discussions. I mean, just think about it. If you were walking down the street and someone standing on the street said, "The Virgin Mary is a whore," how could you just ignore it? How could you ignore that? How could you ignore that and imagine that you love and honor the Blessed Virgin Mary? If you did love and honor Our Lady, you would have to say something. You would have to object. You would have to engage. If you were walking down the road and the sun was shining, it was a beautiful day, and someone said, "It's raining," how would you not respond and say, "It's not raining. What you're saying is not true"? We have to answer for the truth's sake, even if that's all we say. We have to make an objection for the sake of the truth, for our own sake, for the truth's sake, for the sake of anyone else who's listening, who may be influenced by what's being said. We have to make an objection. And I can say this, when I engage in these discussions, I often know that the person I'm arguing with is already fixed in his errors, but I know that there are people reading the discussion who may not be fixed. And they're the ones who usually contact me and say, "Man, that discussion about this was so helpful. Thanks for sharing that video or that Bible passage or that quote from Thomas Aquinas. It made it so clear." It's people reading or listening to these discussions that benefit from them. People who are uncertain, people who are confused, people who have been influenced by false teachers and are not necessarily committed to the false teaching, but they simply don't understand what's wrong with it. I mean, I can't even imagine how many thousands of people I've helped to get out of the fake classical education movement by doing this, because I have to. They're the people who I engage in those arguments for. The people who are reading or listening to the arguments, not necessarily the person who's arguing with me. So I think if you really consider what your goal is in these discussions, in these arguments, in these debates and so on, if you really think about what the purpose is, it allows you to enter into them with an attitude where you've got nothing to lose and much to gain. You've got an obligation to defend the truth. You've got an obligation to refute false teaching. You've got an obligation to admonish the sinner. And you need to fulfill those duties. You've got to learn the real issues on controversial subjects, not just become this lazy copier and paster of the powerless and ineffective memes and quotes that don't even answer the crucial issues. You've got to dig and follow these discussions and see where they end up, because that's often where the real solution is at. And you often see people argue with me with all kinds of arrogance and mockery of things I say and teach, but what you don't say are the private messages that come in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years later, where the person has changed his mind and writes to say thanks, because that discussion, while it didn't change his mind, just introduced enough doubt to make him think twice. And though he didn't admit that in public, privately, he was shaken by it. And so you just see there's more to these discussions than we see on the surface, and you've got to learn that if you're going to get into these things, you've got to be willing to play a long game. You've got to be willing to have some arrogant person say all kinds of nasty things or scoff at you and pretend like he's unaffected. You've got to be willing to refute the things he said, prove the things he says are impossible, show him the sources of the truth, show him the authoritative sources, challenge him and demand demonstrative evidence for statements that are asserted, and realize that doing so can put him in a better disposition, maybe to pray, or to take up the study afresh, or to think twice, or at least to stop teaching it publicly, because he knows that if he does so, he's going to get opposed for it. I think that's our duty. So those are the kinds of things that I think of when I engage in these discussions, and like I said, I have nothing to lose and much to gain. I don't get discouraged. I can't fail. I understand what I can hope to achieve, and I also understand what I should not expect to achieve. And I make sure my goals are what they should be. And that's why I don't get vexed, and I don't get discouraged, and I keep going and going and going, because I'm learning, and they're helpful, and they're productive and useful. So that would be my answer to this question. I don't think it's a question of whether the discussions are useful, but whether or not we've got the right goals for entering into those discussions. I hope that's helpful. God bless.